Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll continue our reading of Unburdened by Conscience. We're talking about the subject of master on slave rape or slave breeding. This is one of the reasons I have so many problems with the FBA people because this history is the history that they come from. And instead of trying to reconnect to their African selves, they're reaching out to their European parts or trying to create and forge an identity out of these heinous acts.
Greetings. My name is the Revolutionary Matron, and my show is called The Learning Curve. I broadcast on a network called KWAZ Radio. There are other hosts on the network I'd like you to meet.
Greetings, everyone. This is Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, inviting you to tune in to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed here belong solely to the respondent, and they do not necessarily reflect any broadcast networks, affiliates, nor sponsors. The Learning Curve is a broadcast created for the benefit of my global community. Black is a consciousness. Content is being used for our commentary, research, criticism, education, scholarship, teaching, preaching, and news reporting. No copyright infringement is intended. I will make enunciation mistakes. I will give you my opinion about the information. And if you ever ask, I will send you my source.
Thank you so much for waiting. A reluctance to call it rape. A revered historian of American slavery once asked, "Do we need to be told again that white men took sexual advantage of Black women during American slavery?" Their answer, not exactly. Depending upon how we interpret the phrase took sexual advantage of, it could mean anything from a euphemism for rape to a misleading mischaracterization of it. In teaching us about the past, the objective historian searches out the facts, and in conveying those facts, he strives for candor and clarity, not concealment. To that end, we should be told not only that white men customarily raped Black women during American slavery, but we should also be told why they did it. Credible explanations for master on slave rape are lacking in most history books about slavery, primarily because few American slavery historians acknowledge that the rape of Black bondswomen was a widespread occurrence with a calculated purpose behind it. Greetings, Sister Ra, and the elders that are here with her. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. Any discussion on master on slave rape should begin with a working definition of rape. Rape is defined as unlawful sexual activity and usually sexual intercourse carried out forcibly or under threat of injury against the will, usually of a female, or with a person who is beneath a certain age or incapable of valid consent. The feminist Susan Brown Miller broadly redefined rape. She said, "It is nothing more or less than a conscious process of intimidation by which all men keep all women in fear. Most historians of American slavery agree that in the antebellum South, the states prosecuted only white women's rapes. As the historian Thomas D. Morris pointed out, the law did not extend the same protection to black women as it did to white women. Her master's personal property, the bondswoman, was not a person in the eyes of the law. Thus, the law did not recognize her rape as an offense, unless her owner regarded it as trespass upon his property and brought a charge. Although rape laws that deny protection to black women would not be considered fair or just today, most antebellum era white Southerners would not have questioned them in any way, shape, form, or fashion. There is also general agreement among historians that during the antebellum period, not all sexual encounters between white men and bondswomen constituted rape. I will interject here that if she was a bondswoman, it had to be rape, because whether he paid for it with some trinket, he threatened her or bullied her out of it, or she tried to seduce him, there was an imbalance in the power dynamic in that relationship, so it was still rape. Continuing, consensual sex occurred across racial lines. Relationships based on genuine mutual desire did develop between some slaveholders and their bondswomen. Mrs. A. M. French, a white woman, wrote about Colonel Richard M. Johnson, a South Carolina slave owner who was so very singular as to treat the mother of his colored daughters as though she were his wife, to give her charge of his household, a seat by his side at the table, addressing her as Mrs. Johnson, to do all of this instead of selling her in the market as some other great statesmen have sold the mothers of their colored children. When Mrs. Johnson became religious and wished to unite with the church, the good minister felt it his duty to tell her that there was an obstacle in the way: the scandal of her living as she did with Colonel Johnson. She immediately communicated the fact to the colonel. "You know, my dear," he said, "I have always been ready to marry you whenever it can be done. I am ready now and will call on your minister about it." He did so and requested the minister to marry them after explaining all the facts of the case. The good minister was now in a worse dilemma than before. What? Marry Colonel Johnson to a colored woman? What could he say? He could only say that the law would not permit such a marriage. So they couldn't even get married legally in the eyes of the law, but we know that they have a lot of laws like that in different states where black on white marriage was illegal. But relationships such as Colonel Johnson's were hardly the norm. Typically, the bondswoman engaged in sexual intercourse with her master, his son, the overseer, the slave trader, or other white men under threat of injury and against her will. If rape is sexual intercourse carried out forcibly or under threat of injury against the will of a woman, why is it that so many historians are reluctant to use the word rape when describing the sexual encounters between slaveholders and their bondswomen? Some of their characterizations of the violent sexual acts suggest that the slaveholder usually seduced the bondswoman. He enticed her to sexual intercourse by means other than force. They masked the slaveholder's brutal takeover of the bondwoman's body while using various abusive hiding words and phrases such as philandering, finding pleasure, prostitution, procuring sexual favors, seduction, sexual experimentation, miscegenation, and even making love. Indeed, The language that some American historians, primarily male and white, employ to conceal non consensual sexual intercourse between master and slave women suggests that during the antebellum period, white on black rape did not occur routinely. For example, Kenneth Stamp wrote that white men had sexual relationships, engaged in sexual experimentation, demanded favors, succumbed to temptations surrounding them, and committed miscegenation as euphemisms for the rape. The historian and sociologist E. Franklin Frazier, slightly more direct in broaching the subject on master slave rape, he was a black man, found that the character of sexual association between white men and black women ranged from rape to voluntary surrender because he saw in some bonds a mutual attraction and a material advantage to be gained for a bondswoman. Leslie Howard Owens noted that slaveholders mixed their blood in the race, gave expression to their human desires, and consorted with bondswomen, but none of them flat out called it rape. The economic historian Robert W. Fogel and Stanley L. Ingerman insisted that white men merely took on mistresses, seduced girls of tender ages, and patronized prostitutes. John Perry characterized the sexual encounters between slave owners and their bondswomen as philandering. Is their reluctance to call it rape just coincidence? No, it's not. Perhaps scholars such as Fogel and Ingerman, Perry, and others made no mention of rape or physical coercion in describing what was more often than not non consensual sex because they had harbored the old racist assumption that white men, particularly those with economic power, have an undeniable right of access to the black women's bodies that they owned. Also reluctant to use the word rape in describing non consensual sexual intercourse between slave owner and bondswomen, Eugene Genovese contended that slaveholders were tempted into intimacies, acted out childish fantasies, and sought casual pleasures, slept with black women, took advantage of institutionally structured concubinage, and quasi-raped black women. The term quasi-raped here is bizarre. What did Genovese mean? Quasi is defined as having some resemblance to. Was he suggesting that most sexual encounters between slaveholders and their bondswomen did not constitute rape? His claim that sex between masters and slave women typically fell between seduction and rape is of no more help to us. Sexual intercourse does not typically fall between seduction and rape. It occurs and is either consensual or non consensual. John Blassingame maintained that white overseers and slaveholders obtained sexual favors of black women. In a decidedly oxymoronic characterization of the sexual encounter, he wrote, generally speaking, the women were literally forced to offer themselves, quote unquote, willingly. So if you're forced to offer yourself willingly or forced to feign willingness, then that means that you're being raped because you're trying to survive the encounter. Role reversal, slaveholder or sufferer of psychic agony. As some American male historians have placed master on slave rape within the context of emotional involvement in human desire, Kenneth Stamp, for example, argued that sexual encounters between masters and their bondswomen were very human indeed. forgiving the slaveholder and defensive of his humanity. Stamp's mischaracterization of the violent sexual encounters underscored the emotional ties that certain masters developed with their slave women, albeit after the violent acts. This mischaracterization at the bondswoman's expense. He and others have humanized the master by focusing on either his emotional involvement or his psychic agony and troubled conscience, while they have dehumanized the bondswoman by ignoring her pain and anguish. For instance, on the topic of master on slave rape, Stamp noted, for many white men, the problem was not so simple. Often the matter weighed heavily upon their consciences long after the affair had ended. Similarly, Genovese wrote, typically the slaveholders could not take their black wenches without suffering psychic agony. As we will see, some slaveholders who raped or ordered the rape of their bondswomen were unburdened by conscience. Bondswoman as a promiscuous collaborator. Other American historians have offered the false pretense that the majority of bondswomen willingly accommodated their owners with sex because they regarded sexual contact with white men as a privilege. Now, that is saying that the woman that was enslaved enticed her slave owner into her bed because she thought that there was some wonderfulness in the whiteness, that she wanted to lay with him because it was an honor and a privilege. Now, that had to be something that was potentially bred into or taught to them by older generations. That's possible, because all things of history are true. All things of history are not true for you. So it's possible that an older woman told her to be kind to Mr. So-and-so because he'll be nice to you and he'll treat you good. But those are just lies. For instance, Leslie Howard Owens would have us believe that a significant number of bondswomen willingly mixed their blood with that of the planters and did not try to disguise the fact. Consequently, these scholars have sanctioned the sexual assault of Black bondswomen by unfairly depicting them as promiscuous collaborators in their own victimization. Master on Slave Rape revealed. The historians Nathan Irvin Huggins, Peter Coughlin, and David Bryan Davis were non-participants in the concealment of the slaveholders' acts of rape. Although Huggins said that white men were never really prohibited from finding their pleasure with Black women, he did call it rape. He wrote, they were unequal encounters in which the source of power was never forgotten. The strategies were simple: to get her alone, away from the others, in a room, in the pantry, the barn, an isolated field, under some pretext, any order. The game would begin, first playful, jovial, pleading, and suggestive. Then, losing his patience, becoming direct and commanding, she might plead, laugh, resist, or even fight him off. But sooner or later it would happen. Perhaps it would be brutal, she falling back, taking his body into hers, whimpering and swallowing her hurt. Once it was over, she could walk away ashamed, not because she was a prudish or coy person, but because her private self had been defiled. This pain would last for a long time to come. Rape is always the same, but the game was not always so. Black women had little choice in the matter if white men were set out to take them. We should give credit to Peter Cochrane as well for candidly noting that far more often slaves who had sex with whites did so against their will, whether victims of outright rape or of the powerlessness that made resistance to advances futile and the use of force in such advances unnecessary. He correctly concluded that casual and motionless sex between captor and captive was a routine feature of life on many, perhaps most, slaveholdings and caused anguish to Black women. David Bryan Davis, perhaps the most forthright male historian on the topic, noted that he found abundant evidence that many slaveholders, sons of slaveholders, and overseers, in effect, raped the wives and daughters of slave families. Davis added that the ubiquity of white on black rape in the antebellum South was sufficient to deeply scar and humiliate Black women, to instill rage in Black men, and to arouse both shame and bitterness in white women. His candor is commendable. As Huggins and Cochrane did, the historian Gerda Lerner and Susan Brownmiller had a clearer understanding of the power dynamic of the master slave sexual encounter, as both knew the bondswoman was powerless to resist her master's sexual advances. Gerda Lerner acknowledged that the rape of Black women by white men was so widespread as to be general, always possible, and could in no way be fought or avoided. Similarly, the feminist historian Susan Brownmiller forcefully argued that the Black woman's body and all of its parts belonged outright to her master. The knife, the whip, and the gun were always there to be used against her. In varying degrees, the typical bondswoman tried to resist her owner's sexual advances, but in most instances, her master engaged in sexual intercourse with her forcibly, or at least by threatening physical injury. In short, he raped her. Rape as an act of counterinsurgency. At a time when books written by such feminists as Susan Brownmiller and others have long since clarified our understanding of rape, most American historians writing on this topic during the last 30 years have not benefited from their work. They have failed or refused to recognize master on slave rape as a violent act and a way of destroying the bondswoman's will to resist. Instead, they've often romanticized the violent encounter, mischaracterizing it as an irrepressible act of love, lust, or desire. What he's saying here is that often in the historical fiction books that they write about master on slave sex, they write about it as though love, lust, or just desire were a part of the relationship and not the brutality of it. Master on slave rape was often not a random act of violence. It was planned and premeditated. It was a political act as well, or what the historian Angela Davis called an unveiled element of counterinsurgency, essential to the white man's subjugation of a people for economic and psychological gain. The slaveholder's rape of the bondswoman was one of the various means of physical and psychological control. If rape, in Brownmiller's words, is nothing more or less than a conscious process of intimidation by which all men keep all women in fear, it should not surprise us that the slaveholder tried to destroy the bondwoman's proclivity towards resistance by raping her. The threat of injury or death. The slave codes of the antebellum South did not inquire into the cause or specific reason for the murder of a slave. As Reverend William Goodell explained in 1853, laws permitting an owner or overseer to kill a slave required only that the slave disobeyed the owner or overseer. What then were the consequences for the many bondswomen who resisted their masters' and overseers' sexual advances? We know that the slave codes prevented them from testifying against whites, and that no white man could ever rape a black woman under Southern law. Goodell observed that the legal relationship of master and bondswoman gave the master unlimited control and full possession of her own person, and forbade her, on the pain of death, to resist him, even if he dragged her into his bed. Thus, the bondswoman gave up her body under the threat of injury or death because she knew that both her owner and her overseer could lawfully take her life for disobeying any command. White men raped free black women in the antebellum South as well. A speaker at North Carolina's convention of 1835 told the auditorium, "A white man may go into the house of a free black, maltreat and abuse him, and commit any outrage upon his family, for all of which the laws cannot reach him unless some white person saw the act," because it was illegal for any black person, colored or free, full black or mulatto, to give testimony against a white person. Black people and mulattoes could sue themselves and each other, could sue other blacks and other mulattoes, but they couldn't do anything to a white person. The Louisiana ex-slave Rose Maddox summed up the disturbing consequence of the slave codes. She said, "I can tell you that a white man laid a nigger gal whenever he wanted her." If the resolute bondswoman intent on protecting her virtue found blandishments or gifts unpersuasive, the slaveholder who was determined to rape her often kept his bullwhip within arm's reach to convince her otherwise. One traveler observed an incident in which a slave owner demanded sexual intercourse of a bondswoman who resisted his command. The traveler noted that she was flogged repeatedly, after which, seeing that her cause was hopeless, gave herself up to be a victim of rape. In the following excerpt from his narrative, Henry Bibb gave an account of another slaveholder who forced his slave girl to have sexual relations with his son by torturing her with the lash. And he said, "I heard the deacon tell one of the slave girls that he had bought her for a wife for his boy Stephen, which office he was compelled her to fill to perform against her will. This he enforced by threat. At the first, the poor girl neglected to do this, having no sort of affection for the man, but she finally was forced to do it by the application of the driver's lash, as threatened by the deacon." So whether it was by threat of force or actual force, she finally succumbed to lay down with that white man because he had threatened her with a lash. Greetings, Anthony McPhail. I'm so glad you're here. It's no problem. I appreciate you for being here last night. The bondswoman who lived in the big house was the most vulnerable to sexual assault by their owners. Prophet John Henry Kemp, a mulatto ex-slave from Florida, related the story of his mother, Arnett Young, the house slave of the slaveholder John Gay. Young was in such a paralyzing fear of being raped by her master that she complained to his wife. So she went to the white woman. She informed Gay's wife that her husband was constantly seeking her for a mistress and threatening her with death if she did not submit. But Miss Gay's response gave Young no comfort. Mrs. Gay replied, "My husband is a dirty man and will find some reason to kill you if you don't. I can't do a thing with him." Unfortunately, working under the same roof and in close quarters with John Gay, Arnett Young was forced under threat of death to submit to him. He raped her. Her son, Prophet John Henry Kemp, born of that heinous act, told us about it. The ex-slave Harriet Ann Jacobs, who lived from 1813 to 1897, writing under the pseudonym Linda Brent, noted that she was forced to live under the same roof with her master, where he, a man 40 years her elder, daily violated the most sacred commands of nature. Where could she have turned for protection? Mindful that slaveholders were accustomed to raping young slave women, the Texas ex-slave Betty Powers, a small child when America legally abolished slavery, said, "They thinks nothing on the plantation about the feelings of the women in there. There ain't no respect for 'em. The overseer and white men do what they like. They do what they want to do. The women better not make no fuss about such. If she does, it am the whipping for her. I sure thanks the Lord surrender done come before I was old enough to have to stand for such a thing." Although most former slaves were reluctant to discuss the matter or to dwell upon it in their narratives, some talked openly about how their owners raped them or their family members, or how they were beaten. Some expressed for resisting their masters' sexual advances, for example. Martha Allen, a former slave in North Carolina, recalled a young master who wanted to have sexual intercourse with her mother, but she told him no. Allen said, "So he chunks a light wood knot and hits her on the head with it." Frequently tied and beaten viciously by her owner in an effort to subdue her pride. So the act of sexual violence was about subduing the pride and character of these people. It was about the psychological intimidation and aspects of this act, as well as the physical violence, as well as the profit motive. They wanted to totally destroy and dehumanize us. The ex-slave Elizabeth Keckley revealed that those savage efforts were not the only thing that caused her pain and anguish while she was residing in Hillsborough, North Carolina's plantation. Keckley wrote the following: "For 4 years, a white man, I spare the world his name, had base designs upon me. I do not care to dwell on this subject, for it is one that is fraught with pain. Suffice it to say that he persisted me and persecuted me for 4 years, and I became a mother." Referring to her child, Keckley added, "The child of which he was the father was the only child that I ever brought into this world. If my poor boy ever suffered any humiliating pangs on account of his birth, he could not blame his mother because she tried to fight him off. For God knows that she did not want to give him life. He must blame the edicts of the society which deemed it no crime to undermine the virtue of girls in my then position." So as you can see, she didn't even want to give birth to a mulatto child. She didn't want to be raped. She didn't want to be violated. She didn't want to procreate with this white man. The fugitive slave John Thompson noted in his autobiography that when his sister resisted the master's sexual overture, the angry slaveholder ordered the girl beaten until the blood stood in puddles under her feet. This became a recurring event. Apparently sold to him for her beauty, a Quintaroon bondswoman named Delia Clark was whipped savagely by her new owner in sight of her brother and mother because she rebuffed the owner's indecent proposal. The disappointed slaveholder sold her to a New Orleans brothel. In his narrative, the South Carolina ex-slave Puritan Milling described the circumstances under which his master raped his aunt. He take advantage of the young gal slaves. You go yonder and shell corn in the crib, he said to one of them. He's the master, so she have to go. Then he send the others to work in some other place. Then would go to the crib. He did this to my very aunt, and she had a mulatto boy. The threat of physical injury or death came from the overseers as well. Many folks told us that one overseer whipped her mother mercilessly until blood ran down her back and heels and bathed her in salt and water because she refused to have sexual intercourse with him. Folks said, mind you now, Mama's master didn't know this was going on. You know, if slaves would tell, why, them overseers would kill them. Fanny Berry, a former slave from Virginia, also recalled that bondswomen would be beat up so when they resisted, and sometimes if you held the overseer, he would kill you. She concluded, us colored women had to go through a plenty, I tell you. Most slaves understood the trying situation through which the bondswoman endured and would not have pointed an accusatory finger at her because of her predicament. Child rape. Rape is also unidentified and defined as unlawfully having sex with a person who is not yet old enough to provide consent, sometimes called child rape or statutory rape. Though it is a further and stronger indictment of the slaveholding class, we should know that the slaveholders raped slave children, boys and girls. The historian Deborah Gray White explained that the root of much of the slave mother's anxiety was fear that her young daughter would be raped. She observed, in the long run, however, a mother could do little but hope her daughter made it through adolescence and young womanhood unscathed by sexual abuse. Harriet Jacobs recalled that the initiation of a slave girl began at an early age, when she was just 14 years or 15 years old. Her owner or his sons or the overseer, or perhaps all of them, would begin to bribe her with presents. If these fail to accomplish their purpose, she is whipped or starved into submission to their will. Apparently, Ben Simpson's sister Emma was raped and impregnated at the age of 14. Simpson said that her master sold her when she's about 15, just before her baby was born. Anthony McPhail says, Ona Judd, the enslaved woman who at the old savage criminal George Washington's house chased all the way to New York City fleeing his advances. Exactly. Lewis Brown, a former slave from Mississippi, also saw masters and overseers catching young Black girls and whipping them to make them do what they wanted. Molly Kingsley remembered one slaveholder who forced her sister, just a small girl, to go out and lay in the table, and 2 or 3 white men would have intercourse with her before they'd let her get up. In the antebellum South, unless they died a martyr's death, innumerable adolescent slave girls became victims of rape. And when they say adolescents, they could mean as young as 8 years old, because at the point that young girls began to have menstrual cycles, they began the barbarous act of raping them. Slave resistance. Despite the likelihood of bodily harm and sometimes death, brave bondsmen tried to protect their wives from sexual assault. For example, the ex-slave W.H. Robinson's father once told him that he had hidden in the woods 11 months after trying to protect his wife from his master. The former slave, Josiah Henson's father, was whipped and his ear cropped off for striking an overseer who had attempted to rape his wife. Some white men must have realized, nonetheless, that sexual encounters with bondswomen could be dangerous. Enraged black men occasionally mustered suicidal courage, to borrow the phrase from Deborah Gray White, and they killed them for such acts. For raping his wife, one enslaved man named Ben shot and killed a white man named Joseph Gooding. Ben was determined to take his master's gun out of the house, where it would generally stood loaded, pursuing Gooding, and shoot him, and he did just that. White Southerners, however, publicly executed bondsmen who killed white men in defense of their slave wives. In 1836, a visitor to Mississippi recorded an incident of an avenging slave who had murdered his master. The visitor noted that the white man had owned the slave's wife as well and was in the habit of sleeping with her. Her slave husband confessed that he had killed his owner because of it, and he believed that he was going to be rewarded in heaven for it. Indeed, the act cost the black man his life. He was burned at the stake, beheaded, and his head stuck on a pole for public display. Slaveholders tortured, mutilated, and frequently killed black men for coming to the defense of their mates. For the bondsman, standing up to the master in defense of the bondswoman's virtue was tantamount to committing suicide. Inasmuch as the bondsmen were powerless, were just as powerless as the bondswomen. The women were sometimes inclined to defend themselves as the men were to defend them. The Maryland ex-slave Richard Max told us about one mulatto slave woman of fine stature and good looks who was put up for sale. She was of such high spirits and determined disposition that when the slave trader purchased her and attempted to rape her, she grabbed a knife and castrated him. He died the next day from the injury. Although charged with murder, atypically, she was fortunate enough to have been protected by Union troops and ultimately was taken to Washington, D.C., where she was freed. In 1850, Robert Newsom, a white Missouri farmer and grandfather over 60 years of age, purchased a 14-year-old slave girl named Celia and raped her as he took her home. In fact, the slaveholder impregnated Celia 3 times during her teenage years. Ill during the 3rd pregnancy and fed up with being raped, on June 23, 1855, Celia warned Newsom that she would hurt him if he tried to rape her again. Subsequently, Newsom went down to Celia's cabin one night and attempted to rape her. But armed with a stick, she struck him twice, killing him. She then burned his body in the fireplace and spread his ashes outside. When the town discovered the murder of her master, Celia was tried, convicted of first-degree murder, and ordered executed by hanging. Ironically, the town delayed her execution until December 21st, 1855, so that she could give birth to the property of her master's estate, but the child was stillborn. The practice of delaying the execution of pregnant slaves until the birth of their babies was not unique. Charity Morris, an ex-slave from Arkansas, told us the story of her pregnant cousin Sally. Sally had murdered an evil master named Jim because he had beaten her and other slaves habitually and had locked them up until sunrise every night when they returned home from the fields. Lying in wait for her master, Sally cracked him in the head with a poker. With the help of another slave named Little Joe, she put his head in the fireplace. An investigation of her owner's death revealed his blood on Sally's underdress. Although Sally was tried and convicted of murder, Morris said that her execution by hanging was delayed until she gave birth to her baby. Lucy, another slave, resisted the sexual advances of her white owner and successfully plotted with her slave lover Frank to murder him. Both Lucy and Frank were hanged in the public gallows, and according to Charles Ball, there were at least 15,000 people present at the scene, more than half of whom were black, all the masters, for a great distance around the country, having permitted or compelled their people, their slaves, to come see this hanging. For the bondswoman who killed the slaveholder, even in defense of her virtue, white vengeance was swift and certain. Rape and slave breeding. In 1790, the black population of the United States numbered a little more than 750,000. Almost 89% of that population lived in the South Atlantic states, where the greatest demand for black labor existed. About 18 years later, on January 1st, 1808, the Atlantic slave trade was officially banned. Before that date, Article 1, Section 9 of the United States Constitution prohibited Congress from limiting the importation of slaves. Notwithstanding the ban on slave imports, the slave population increased nearly fourfold in the years between 1810 and 1860. And it's this fact that FBA tries to use to say that they were already here, and the expansion of the Americas encapsulated more people, but they negate to remember the breeding farms and the forced breeding. There were people here, and some of the people here were natives and were amalgamated into that, but the larger population of them were enslaved Africans and people that had African roots. During the same period, average prime slave prices, which fluctuated with the price of cotton, rose from $900 to $1,600. If it was illegal to import slaves at the time, why did the population grow so rapidly? The conventional explanation for the exceptional rate of slave population growth offered by some American slavery historians is that it was natural, due to an equal ratio of female to male slaves, less grueling work conditions relative to those in other parts of the Americas, and the slaves' so-called promiscuity. With the exception of John Hope Franklin, historians generally attribute little, if any, of the increase in the slave population during the antebellum era to the slaveholders' practice of slave breeding. The master's rape of the bondswoman, however, was not merely an act of counterinsurgency. It was a profit-making phenomenon. Forcibly impregnating the bondswoman, the slaveholder increased the size of his slave labor force. Kenneth Stamp believed that systematic slave breeding was unlikely. He found scant available evidence of it, but Franklin not only acknowledged that innumerable slaveholders deliberately undertook to increase the number of saleable slaves by advantageously mating them, he called the antebellum South's practice of slave breedings one of the most fantastic manipulations of human development in the history of mankind. Slave breeding did occur. Absolute control over the bondwoman's reproductive schedule meant a steady supply of slave babies. Slave owners compelled their bondswomen, married or unmarried, to bear children. One slaveholder reported that in the states of North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Missouri, as much attention was paid to the breeding and growth of black slaves as to that of horses and mules. He noted that the slave owners further south raised them for their own use and for the market. Slaveholders measured a bondswoman's value by her physical strength, her portliness, and most important, the number of healthy children she bore. The master purchased young bondswomen expecting his slave population to increase rapidly. He found in slave breeding one of the more effective ways of increasing his agricultural capital. On August 20th, 1849, for instance, the Texas slaveholder Alva Fitzpatrick penned a letter to his nephew giving him the following instructions. Get as many young Negro women as you can. Get as many cows as you can. It is the greatest country for an increase that I ever saw in my life. I have been here 6 years and have had 15 Negro children born, and last year 3 more young Negro women commenced breeding, which will add 7 born last year, and 5 of them are living and doing well. Attend to the foregoing instructions, and in 10 or 15 or 20 years, you will do as well as any man in this country or any other country. So he was telling him how to go about buying black women for breeding purposes. Isaiah Green, a former slave from Georgia, told us that large slave families were the aim and pride of the slave owner, who quickly learned which of his bondswomen bore children and which did not. He said a greedy owner got rid of those who didn't breed. Barry Clay, though never a slave, recalled that the master demanded that his bondwoman be fruitful, as did Green. He remarked, a barren woman was separated from her husband and usually sold. In fact, the Arkansas ex-slave Mary Brown's grandmother was sold for that reason. As a young woman, she bore no children. A firm conviction that she was barren, damaged goods, led her owner to sell her to a slaveholder named Mr. Taylor. Perhaps determined not to be sold again, Brown's grandmother subsequently bore 11 children, but Taylor sold them all away from her for financial gain. Although many bondswomen were fearful of being sold, their fertility sometimes brought them, if not their children, at least some measure of security against it. As mentioned previously, generally, rape statutes did not protect young slave girls in the South in the way that they protected young white girls. In 1857, the Mississippi legislature made it a capital offense for a slave to have carnal relations with any white girl under the age of 14. That law, and similar laws enacted throughout the antebellum South afforded black girls, slaves and free, no protection. Consequently, not a few slave girls were impregnated as soon as they reached puberty. Deborah Gray White maintained that bondswomen typically bore their first children at the age of 19. Yeah, right. 2 years younger than the age at which Southern white women generally had their first children. But writing in 1919, the woman's suffrage advocate Rebecca L. Felton noted that because frequent births on slave babies were very profitable for the slaveholder, slave childbearing sometimes began at 12 years of age. And she probably thought she was being appropriate in saying that it started at 12. I'm telling you, they started as soon as she started her period. And for some girls, that was as young as 8. The North Carolina ex-slave Hilliard Yellowday also said that the slave girls were expected to have children as soon as they were capable. Some of them had children at the age of 12 and 13 years old. The slaveholder assigned a high market value to young childbearing bondswomen because they brought him more wealth in any form. They brought him more wealth in the form of slave babies. The North Carolina ex-slave Fannie Moore, in fact, said, "The breed woman always bring more money than the rest, even the men. When they put her on the block, they pull all her children around her and show folks that she can have children." Coming across a slave auction on his journey through Memphis, Tennessee, a former slave from Arkansas named Boston Blackwell saw a young slave woman of child-rearing age bid off for $1,500. He also said, "They always bought good money." Isaiah Green opined a slave trader could always sell a breeding woman for twice the usual amount. Fertile young slave girls, each commanding as much as $1,000 or more on the auction block, were expected by their masters to bear healthy slave children as early as possible, and at least once every 2 years thereafter. Slave traders placed advertisements in newspapers throughout the South emphasizing their reproductive qualities. In one instance, on May 16, 1838, a leading political paper of South Carolina named the Charleston Mercury ran an advertisement for the sale of one young slave woman raised in Virginia and her 2 little girls, describing the bondswoman as remarkably strong and healthy, very prolific in her generating qualities, and naturally providing a rare opportunity to any person who wishes to raise a family of healthy servants for his own use. Realizing the great demand for slave labor and fearful that this labor supply would soon become exhausted, white Southerners who had sufficient funds purchased fertile young slave girls, believing that they were sound investments because slaveholders demanded and received fruitful returns. Deborah Gray White found the American slavery experiences of Black men and women equally severe, but she underscored the most significant difference between the two. The women were compelled by their masters to bear and nurture children. White also pointed out, in the pre-Civil War period, Black women were very prolific. According to demographers, the crude birth rate exceeded 50 per 1,000, meaning that each year more than 1/5 of the Black women aged 15 to 44 bore a child. One of the more prolific childbearing bondswomen, a grandmother of the Arkansas ex-slave Josephine Howell, gave birth to 21 children. Howell said that her grandmother's fertility made her very valuable to her owner, the former slave Temple Herndon, 103 years old, when interviewed, commented that she was worth a heap to Master George because she had so many muley strong and healthy children. About bondwomen's child rearing duties, Susan Brownmiller wrote the following. They were expected to breed. Some were retained expressly for that purpose. In the lexicon of slavery, breeder woman, childbearing woman, too old to breed, and not a breeding woman were common descriptive terms. In country, breeding was so crucial to the planter economy that the African slave trade was banned, and slave woman's value increased in accordance with her ability to produce healthy offspring. Domestic production of slave babies for sale to other slave states became a small industry in the fertile Upper South. The state of Virginia annually exported between 6,000 and 20,000 homegrown slaves to the deeper South, where the land, the climate, and the harsher workload took precedence over fertility. The Virginia reared slave, like Virginia leaf tobacco, was always in great demand. In many instances, the slaveholder paired off the slave girl and a mate of his choosing and ordered her to bear children, particularly when he owned both slaves. John Perry found it very rare, and Deborah Gray White maintained that it was atypical for a slaveholder to assign a male slave to a female slave and demand that they have children. When Adela S. Dixon interviewed 89-year-old Barry Clay in 1936, however, his recall of the slaveholder's general practice was to the contrary. Clay informed us that the master selected the bondwoman's husband, and only in rare occasions was the desire of the individual considered. Many ex-slaves had similar recollections. For example, a former slave from Texas named Jacob Branch said, "Massa go by a colored man named Uncle Charlie Finner, brought him to the quarters and say, 'Renee, here you a husband.' And then they turn to Uncle and say, 'Charlie, this your woman.' Then they considered them married. That's the way they married back then. By the master's word." Betty Powers also told us, "Them times colored folk are just put together. The master say, 'Jim and Nancy, you go live together. And when that order give, it better be done.'" The Arkansas ex-slave Virginia, whose nickname was Jenny Davis, said that a slave owner put her Aunt Eliza and her aunt's husband together. One observer of the slave auctions, the Texas ex-slave Jordan Smith, recalled that the slave buyer manhandled the bondswoman to determine her physical strength. Once convinced that she was a good breeder, he would purchase her and put her with a total stranger for childbearing purposes. Smith said, "They lined up women on one side and the men on the other. A buyer could walk up and down and between the two rows and grab the woman and try to throw her down and feel her to see how she put up. If she's pretty strong, he'd say, 'Is she a good breeder?' If the gal was 18 or 19 and put up good, She was worth about $1,500. Then the buyer would pick out a strong young nigger boy about the same age and buy him. When he got home, he'd say to them, I want you two to stay together. I want young niggers. Slaveholders loaned their bondswomen to masters on the neighboring plantations for childbearing purposes as well. J.W. Whitfield, a former slave from Arkansas, said, if a landowner had a girl and another wanted that girl for one of his men, they would give him to her to wife. They would give him her to wife. When the North Carolina ex-slave Willie McCullough's mother turned the age of 16, her owner went to the local slaveholder, picked out a 6-foot-tall black man, almost an entire stranger to her, and ordered her to marry him. McCullough said that her master introduced several different men to her, just about the same as if she had been a cow. Hilliard Yellerday similarly commented that slaveholders sometimes borrowed large, 6-foot-tall, hale-hardy black men from nearby plantations for their young slave girls. Adolescent slave girls were required to receive the attention of men, their owner's choice, even though some of them loved someone else. Yellerday said, this was a general custom. In that situation, the bondswoman had no reproductive rights that her master was bound to respect. She had no control over her body. Her childbearing decisions were guided not by her will, but rather by her owner's will. In 1847, William Wells Brown gave an account of the slaveholder John Calvert and his young slave woman Lavinia. Calvert sold away Lavinia's fiance and demanded that she pick another husband for childbearing purposes, but she was determined not to marry another man. According to Brown, Mr. Calvert whipped her in such a manner that it was thought that she would die. Engaged to a young man from a neighboring plantation, another bondswoman found out about her master's intention to stick her arbitrarily with a young male slave of his choosing, but she would not have it so. The fugitive slave, John Brown, noted, in fear and desperation, she made a strike for freedom. We don't know whether or not she obtained her freedom. No doubt her owner was determined to secure her capture. Primarily, economic considerations influenced the slaveholder's choice of mates for his slaves. Would the pair beget stout, healthy offspring, physically prepared for a life of incessant and arduous toil? Katie Darling said that her master would pick out a portly man and a portly gal and just put them together because he wanted the stock. J.W. Whitfield recollected that some masters would reserve a healthy and robust child born of a slave couple for breeding purposes so that they were not bothered about a puny and sickly slave child. The 97-year-old Missouri ex-slave Bill Simmons also remembered that neighboring plantation owners would ask a big, strong bondsman to come over and see their slave women, hoping that he might want to marry one of them. As did Whitfield Sims recalled that certain slaveholders did not want small black men marrying their bondswomen because those owners valued their slaves only for what they could do, just as they did some wild horses. Some slaveholders amassed great wealth by breeding slaves solely for the market. Charlotte Martin was owned by a very cruel master named Judge Wilkerson. He found it very profitable to breed and sell slaves. Martin said he selected the strongest and best male and female slaves and mated them exclusively for breeding. The huskiest babies were given the best attention in order that they might grow into sturdy youths, for it was those who brought the highest prices at the slave markets. Louisa Noor Everett, nicknamed Noor because she was from Norfolk, Virginia, Everett, a 90-year-old ex-slave, not only recalled her owner bred slaves, she told her story of how she and her ex-slave husband, Sam Everett, met as slave children on Big Jim McCain's plantation. An evil master, Big Jim McLean owned over 100 slaves. Louisa Everett said that he mated his slaves indiscriminately and without regard for family unions. If he thought a certain pair of slaves might have strong, healthy babies, he would force them to have sexual relations, even though they were married to other slaves. If they were reluctant to engage in sexual intercourse, Big Jim, with a bullwhip over his shoulder, forced them to have sex in his presence. He employed the same tactic when he thought a certain slave couple was not producing children fast enough. Everett said that Big Jim McLean took pleasure in watching his slaves have sex and often entertained his friends in this manner. Slaveholders made it very clear to their young bondswomen that they were expected to bear healthy slave children. Although some masters offered rewards such as calico dresses and silver dollars to prolific slave women, others obtained the desired results through threat or torture or sale. In the following excerpt from her narrative, Louisa Noor Everett described the lewd manner in which her owner forced her upon her slave husband, Sam. Master Jim called me and Sam to him and ordered Sam to pull off his shirt. That was all the McLean niggers wore. And he said to me, Noor, do you think you can stand this big nigger? And he said, and he had that old bullwhip across his shoulder. And Lord, that man could hit so hard. So I just said, yes, sir, I guess so. And tried to hide my face so I couldn't see Sam's nakedness. But he made me look at him anyhow. Well, he told us that we must get busy and do it in his presence. And we had to do it. After that, we was considered man and wife. Me and Sam was a healthy pair and had fine big babies. So I never had another man forced on me. Thank God Sam was kind to me and I learned to love him. Some slaveholders reserved healthy and physically robust adult male slaves solely for breeding purposes. For example, Willie Williams, a former slave from Louisiana, said that his owner was anxious to breed big slaves, individuals who were able to perform lots of work and sell for a heap of money. His master owned 10 big, strong bondswomen who were not allowed to get married. Instead, a doctor examined the women and a robust male slave, and their owner ordered them to replenish his plantation with healthy young slave labor. Williams remarked, that nigger do no work but watch them women's, and he and the husband for all of them. The master sure was raising some fine niggers that way. The father of Arkansas ex-slave Oscar Felix Junell, whose name was William W. Junell, told him that the slaves took the finest, portliest looking black men for breeding purposes. He also testified that they wouldn't let them strain themselves up for nothing like that. They wouldn't make them do no much work. Other former bondsmen revealed that their fathers were breeding slaves. Barney Stone, for example, informed us that his father, Buck Grant, a buck slave on the slaveholder John Grant's plantation, was used as a male cow is used on the stock farm. He was hired out to other plantations for that purpose and was regarded as a valuable slave. Lewis Jones said that his father, a breeding slave owned by a slaveholder named Fred Tate, was forced by his master to reproduce 50 slave children by 7 different bondswomen. Although the Texas ex-slave Elegy Davison was married, his owner forbade him from having just one woman. A breeding slave as well, Davison recalled that his master assigned him about 15 slave women and compelled him to father slave children. He had no recollection as to the precise number of children he fathered, but he knew they numbered over 100. We know that some slaveholders bred strong, healthy slaves as one would breed animals, but the North Carolina ex-slave Cornelia Andrews told us some sterilized sickly slaves because they were considered an economic risk. She said, they ain't let no little runny nigga have no children. No, sir. They ain't let them operate on them. They let them like they does male hogs so that they can't make no little runny children. So basically, if you were a small male, they actually sterilized you so that you couldn't reproduce. Assigning bondswomen sex mates and forcing them to bear slave children against their will, whether for their owners or for the market, probably bore for many the same psychological consequences as rape. The master of Texas ex-slave Rose Williams forced her against her will to procreate with a slave of his choosing. She never forgot the experience and vowed never to marry or have more children after she gained her freedom. What follows is her vivid recollection of the event. Massa Black calls me to the block and the auction and say to the auction man, "What am I offered for this portly, strong wench? She's never been abused and will make a good breeder." The auction man say, "She sold to Mr. Hawkins." There am one thing Massa Hawkins does to me, and I can't shunt from my mind. What he done is forced me to live with that Rufus against my wants. I was about 16 years old. He was big. I said to myself, I'm not going to live with that Rufus. That night, when him come in the cabin, I grabbed the poker and sets it on the bench and says, "Get from me before I bust your brains and stomp on them." Then the next day the master called me and tell me, "Woman, I pays big money for you, and I's done that 'cause I wants you to raise me children. I's put you with Rufus for that purpose. Now if you doesn't want a whipping at the stake, you do what I wants." I thinks about Massa buying me off in the block and saving me from being separated from my folks, and about being whipped at the stake. There it is. What am I to do? I decides to do as Massa wish, and so I yields. I never marries, 'cause one experience was enough. After what I does for the master, I's never want no truck again with any man. The Lord forgive this colored woman, but he gonna have to excuse me and look for some others to replenish the earth. Bondswomen who were unwilling to comply with their owners' reproductive demands must have experienced humiliation of loss and pride and self-esteem when they were sexually violated. But enslavement required the slave labor force to reproduce itself. Not only did advances in the manufacturing processes in England fuel her increasing demand for the South's cotton fiber, but the New England school teacher Eli Whitney facilitated the seeding of that cotton fiber through his 1793 invention and patent of the cotton gin. The demise of the transatlantic slave trade and the anticipated growth of the South's cotton industry compelled materialistic slaveholders to increase their domestic production of slaves. By 1860, the slave population of the United States had increased to almost 4 million, making it possible for the southern states to annually produce 5,387,000 bales of cotton. The rapid growth of the South's cotton industry would not have been possible without the great abundance of cheap land located further southwest and the increasing supply of slave labor in the larger part. The result of the slaveholders' practice of domestic slave breeding. Indeed, in 1858, the prophets, an anonymous author says, the prophets of farming wrote, I would not own any gang of Negroes where there was no increase. I would not own any gang of Negroes where there was no increase. So if it wasn't profitable, I wouldn't own Negroes. So obviously it's profitable for them. Chapter 13, Begetting Children for Profit. We have this section, and this is our final chapter of this section. Most American historians have not examined the slaveholders' economic rationale for white-on-black rape, either because they mischaracterize it solely as an act of passion or adventure, or they deny its widespread occurrence. Kenneth Stamp, for example, described the rapes of bondswomen by white adolescents as casual adventures in sexual experimentation. In his mind, white college students and other white men who raped slave women were demanding favors. John Perry denied that widespread master-on-slave rape occurred during the antebellum period and asked, would a slave owner risk at least consternation of his slaves, and more likely the discipline problem his philandering would cause? Henry Bibb answered this question in the affirmative, charging that slaveholders can do and enter at night or day the lodging places of slaves, break up bonds of affectionate families, and destroy all of their domestic and social union for life. Bibb noted that they were able to do so because the laws of the South afforded slaves no protection. When asked whether or not white men respected as married women the wives of slaves, a Petersburg, Virginia slave replied, no, they don't make no difference whether we colored women is married or not. White folks just do what they have a mind to do with them. Black bondswomen who were beautiful were most likely to be raped by white men. In fact, Harriet Jacobs observed that if God bestowed beauty on the bondswoman, it would prove to be her greatest curse. That which commands admiration in the white woman, Jacobs wrote, only hastens the degradation of the female slave. Louisa Noor Everett agreed, saying that quite often her master and even his guests would have sex with his female slaves, choosing for themselves the prettiest of the young women. She said sometimes they forced the unhappy husbands and lovers of their victims to look on. Richard Max, who also informed us that he knew of several cases in which good looking slave women paid the price for their beauty as victims of rape, but he found those cases too distasteful to discuss. Leslie Howard Owens believed that master on slave rape probably intensified animosities between the races and may have caused disunity within the slave family. In and of itself, that potentially could have created a slave discipline problem for the slaveholder, but an advantage, chiefly economic, outweighed any potential control problem the master's act of sexual assault may have caused. As the demand for slave labor increased, the materialistically obsessed slaveholder attempted to increase the whole population of his most valuable asset, his slaves, but he wanted to increase each slave's individual market value as well. The slaveholder understood that forcibly impregnating bondswomen through the use of potent white men served a dual purpose. It increased his slave labor supply and it produced an improved mixed breed of mulatto slaves, slaves who commanded a higher price at the auction block. I will add here that yes, it produced a different breed of slave, a mixed race slave, but that slave owner also profited because they probably paid to have sex with these women and they made a profit off of the children that these rape encounters created. So think about it. He was a prostitute and an adoption agency. He was prostituting her to these white men and he was using the babies as a profit motive. Laws throughout the antebellum South prohibited whites from marrying blacks, whether they were enslaved or free, as such marriages would have undermined the American slavery regime. Marriage laws in North Carolina and South Carolina, for example, forbade and criminalized black-white marriages. No similar law, however, prohibited whites from having sex with blacks in the southern states. The jurist and historian A. Leon Higginbotham, Jr., who lived from 1928 to 1998, argued, far from representing a threat to the American slavery regime, interracial sex served as its lifeblood. It mattered not that the child born of interracial sex had part white blood. As early as 1662, the colony of Virginia enacted a law requiring that all children born in the colony held bond or free be held bond or free according to the status of their mother. Maryland passed a similar law in 1681. The laws of the antebellum South considered a mere drop of African blood sufficient to pollute an ocean of European blood, consigning that mixed blood children to a lifetime of servitude because his mother was a slave. The Arkansas ex-slave Rachel Fairley's aunt bore 2 mulatto slave children fathered by her master. Fairley said, they were as white as the white children nearly, but their mother was a colored woman, and that made the difference. Fully backed by the legal system, the slaveholder insisted that raping his slave woman was his property right, And one economic privilege or benefit of that right was begetting mulatto children from the act and placing them in the slave on the slave auction block for his material gain. Not a few slaveholders wanted to reproduce more profitable young mulatto slave children, and as one traveler journeying across the South observed, the master's licentiousness did breed for him a peculiarly valuable stock of cattle. The ideology of white supremacy underpinned the American slavery regime. Consequently, in the matter of color, the slaveholding class devalued blackness and assigned a relatively higher market value to whiteness. In 1850, one traveler thus wrote, "Great solicitude is often manifested that breeding wenches, as they call them, should be the mothers of mulatto children. As nearer the young slaves approach to white, the higher the price will be, especially if they are females." One reason that it's true that they wanted to continue to create these light skinned females is because they were sexually desirable, but they could also ensure that she could make them more slaves. So if they had a pretty light skinned chick, then a pretty light skinned woman, then she would continue to make them more slaves. A male mulatto had more of a chance of getting free because he would fight his way to freedom. He would perhaps kill his master, but a female was terrorized and she often was more heavily watched and policed because she was going to be profitable for years and years to come. The slaveholders' demand for more valuable mulatto slaves was the major impetus behind his impregnation of the bondswomen. Touring New Orleans between 1829 and 1830, the English traveler Simon Annesley Farrell noted that if the offspring were a beautiful mulatto female, up to $1,000 would be obtained for her in the New Orleans market. John Perry insisted that there was a severe social stigma attached to interracial sexual activities in the 19th century. The white slaveholding class may have officially condemned interracial sex because there may have been a social stigma associated with it, but it was hardly severe enough to dissuade slaveholders from raping their bondswomen for gain. During the antebellum South, During the antebellum period, observers from not only the South and the North, but from abroad as well, could not help but comment on what they saw as the South's growing mulatto slave population. Writing in 1836, the traveler Frederick Marryat referred to a system of amalgamation which had been carried to such an extent that you very often meet with slaves whose skins are whiter than their masters. Georgian Rebecca L. Felton recalled violations of the moral law that made mulattoes as common as blackberries. The Northern Observer, Mrs. A. M. French, opined that it was slavery alone that made the South the African bleaching ground. While some white mistresses bitterly acknowledged the fact that their husbands' interracial sexual activities, others coped with those activities by sticking with their proverbial heads in the sand. They were in denial. The South Carolina ex-slave mom writer Emanuel, for example, said that her mistress was very proud of all the black slave children playing around on her front steps, but she found the only yellow one in the group troubling. The mistress asked the child, "Who's your papa?" Too young to know better, the slave child told his owner exactly what his mother had told him. According to Mum Ryer Emanuel, The mistress replied, "Well, get off my step. Get off and stay off there, 'cause you don't no ways belong to me." Regarding all the mulatto slave children she saw in Southern households, Mary Boykin Chestnut made the following entry in her journal on March 18, 1861. Like the patriarchs of old, our men live all in one house with their wives and their concubines, and the mulattoes one sees every family exactly resemble the white children, and every lady tells you who the father of all the mulatto children in everybody else's household is, but those in her own, she seems to think dropped from the clouds or pretends to think so. In the federally funded WPA interviews conducted during the 1930s, several former slaves talked openly about the master's practice of impregnating their bondswomen for profit. One even had a name for slaveholders who fathered mulatto children. Martha Allen referred to her mulatto father as master and her grandfather as a carpet getter. But now, how widespread was the practice? From the testimony of several ex slaves from North Carolina, it appears that it was commonplace. For example, the former slave, Reverend Squire Dowd, said that the bondswoman having children by the master was common. His relatives on his mother's side of the family were mixed blooded. Lizzie Williams also told us that many black women bore children for the master, that if the master was a mean man, she said that the slaveholders just told the bondswomen what to do and they knew better than to fuss. Cognizant of many bondswomen bearing children of white slave owners, W.L. Post similarly asserted, "She know better than not to do what they say," Post recalled, that the masters took those very same children, their own flesh and blood, and made slaves out of them. From the testimony of former slaves from other southern states, it also is apparent that the master on slave rape for profit was prevalent. Born in 1843, the Georgia ex-slave Jack Maddox recalled that white slaveholders fathered plenty of children with black women. They didn't ask them, they just took them, he remarked. Carrie Mason, another former slave from Georgia, said that slave impregnation by the master or his sons happened a lot in them days. She remembered one slaveholder who would tell his sons to go down to the slave quarters and reproduce more mulatto slave children. The Texas ex-slave Chris Franklin also remembered lots of places where the young masses had heirs by black women. Charlotte Martin similarly informed us that her owner sometimes had sexual relations with his bondswomen because the products of miscegenation were very remunerative. She said that the mulatto offspring were in great demand as house servants. The Mississippi-born ex-slave Solomon Oliver commented on his master John A. Miller's interracial sexual activities. He said, "Master John was bad after the slave women. A yellow child showed up every once in a while," Oliver exclaimed. "My own mammy, Mary, was the master's own daughter." Former slaves from Oklahoma gave us similar accounts. John White told us sometimes the white folks go around the slave quarters for the night. The slaves talked about it amongst themselves. After a while, they'd be a new baby, yellow. George G. King recalled that two of his older sisters, Eva and Laura, were fathered by a white man. Harriet Robinson, when interviewed, was 95 years old, former slave from Oklahoma, and said that her sister Liza, herself a mulatto slave, bore 3 children of her master's son. So you see that? So she was a mulatto slave, probably the father's daughter, and he bred his children together to make more slaves. Slaveholders compelled other bondwomen by the threat of death or bodily harm to submit to impregnation by slaveholding whites. The historian Arthur W. Calhoun, in fact, noted the tradition of the importation of college boys from the North to spend a profitable summer improving the slave breed. Since white college students from the North were taught that they were dealing with an inferior race, they could be persuaded that raping black bondswomen was a lucrative summer job. Indeed, slaveholders gave financial rewards to white men who fathered mulatto slaves. One actually offered a white man $20 for every impregnation of a slave woman to improve the breed. Mixed blood slave children for sale. It is a myth that large numbers of slaveholders gave protection to their mixed blood slave children and generally emancipated them. Although there were a disproportionate number of mulattoes in the free black population, seldom did slaveholders free their mulatto children. Many suffered greatly in bondage as their fathers or their white siblings sold them to slave traders. In 1836, the Foreign Observer Frederick Marryat noted one congressman, a Georgian, who brought into the world a family of mulatto slave children only to sell them all by public auction during his lifetime. Touring the South between the years 1829 and 1830, Simon Ansley Farrell found it an occurrence of no uncommon nature to see the Christian father sell his own daughter, or the brother his own sister by the same father. A former slave from Louisiana named Martha Johnson provided the example of her mulatto slave mother. She was sold by her mother's son, her half brother, after her father died. Several former slaves recalled that if the price were right, slaveholders would sell their mulatto children just like other slaves. The South would tell their mulatto slave children. The South Carolina ex-slave Sevilla Burnell, for example, said that her master sold his mulatto children from their mother to a slave trader. Isaiah Green told us that his mulatto grandmother, Betsy Willis, was placed on the auction block by her slave-holding father. Molly Kinsey also remembered many young mulatto slave girls who were sold by their fathers, taken right out of the yards with their white children, and sold like herds of cattle. Although mulatto bondswomen were in great demand as house servants, the foreign traveler Francis William Newman observed that the beautiful mulatto slave girls, some even reared in their slave-holding fathers' houses, were sold after their fathers died or because of financial difficulties to white men for their sexual gratification. Slave traders shackled large numbers of young mulatto bondswomen, transported them to southern cities, and sold young mulatto bondswomen at enormous prices to white men. When asked the price of a mixed blood on sale at Alexandria, Virginia, one slave trader replied, We can't afford to sell the girl Emily for less than 1800. We have 2 or 3 offers for Emily from gentlemen from the South. Generally, slaveholders did not acknowledge their mulatto slave children. The white supremacist political activist Rebecca L. Felton, in fact, noted the crime that made slavery a curse lies in the fact that unbridled lust placed the children of bad white men in slave pens on auction blocks, and no regard was shown to parentage or parental responsibility in such matters. Lizzie Williams recalled a mulatto slave child named Emily, whose slaveholding father paid no more attention to her than to the rest of his slaves. The ex-slave Annie L. Burton's mistress often told her that her father was a slaveholder who owned the plantation a few miles from the one on which she resided. Burton noted that she never spoke to her father and could not remember that he had ever noticed her or in any way acknowledged her as his child. Apparently, he considered her as just another slave child. At least Burton knew her father's identity and where he lived. John Thomas Williams, a less fortunate North Carolina born mulatto ex slave, did not know his father, his mother, or any of his relatives. He said, I have asked 1,000 questions trying to find out who my people are, but no one has ever told me who I am or who my people are. If I have any brothers or sisters, I don't know it. I have nothing to say about being partly white. I leave that to your imagination. In 1836, Harriet Martineau commenced on the insightful observation of a Southern planter concerning slaveholders who fathered and sell mulatto children. She wrote, a gentleman of the highest character, a Southern planter, observed that the very general connection of white gentlemen with their female slaves introduced a mulatto race whose numbers would become dangerous if their white parents were permitted to render them free. The liberty of emancipating them was therefore abolished, while the selling of them remained. These planters who sell their offspring for the sake of their purses dare to raise the cry of amalgamation against the abolitionists of the North. Some masters sold not only their mulatto slave children, but they sold the children's mothers as well. For instance, the slaveholder John Street fathered the Kentucky ex-slave Amy Elizabeth Patterson, the firstborn child of her slave mother, Amy Elizabeth, said that her owner operated a slave agency where he collected slaves and annually sold them to dealers in human flesh. Contemplating a move to another territory, Street decided to auction off his entire inventory of slaves, including his daughter Amy Elizabeth and her mother, to the highest bidder. Clearly humiliated when her father had placed her on the auction block, Amy Elizabeth Patterson said, that was the greatest crime ever visited on the United States. It was worse than the cruelty of overseers, worse than hunger. When a father can sell his own child, humiliate his own daughter by auctioning her on the slave block, what good could be expected where such practices are allowed? Yes, slavery is a curse to this nation, a curse with which still shows itself in hundreds of homes where mulatto faces are evidence of a heinous sin and proof that there has been a time when American fathers sold their children at the slave marts of America. Harriet Jacobs observed that the mistresses were not troubled either about the selling of their husbands' mulatto children because they regarded those children as property, as marketable as pigs on the plantation. She noted that it was seldom that they did not make them aware of the fact that they were property by passing them on into the slave traders' hands as soon as possible. The fact is, some slaveholding husbands sold light complexioned slave children at the behest of their embarrassed or bitter wives. Douglas Dorsey, a former slave from Florida, explained to his interviewer why his mistress asked that his light skinned brother be sold. The interviewer, James Johnson, wrote the following: To his mother and father was born a little baby boy, whose complexion was rather light. Miss Mater at once began accusing Colonel Mater of being the father of the child. Naturally, the colonel denied it, but Miss Mater kept harassing him about it until finally he agreed to his wife's desire and sold the child. It was taken from its mother's breast at the age of 8 months and auctioned off on the day of January the 1st to the highest bidder. Consider the emotional, psychological devastation suffered by that slave mother when her master snatched her newborn from her breast and sold the baby to a slave trader, never to be heard from again. Unburdened by conscience, slaveholders believed that it was perfectly natural to sell their own flesh and blood into slavery, to beget children for profit. Since it was common for slaveholders to father mulatto children and sell them for gain, we might wonder whether or not respect for the slave family took a back seat to the master's economic interests. What have American historians said about the slaveholders' decision to break up black slave families? Over the last 40 years, why they have insisted that masters generally took into account a moral consideration and an economic consideration of deciding to sell their slaves from their loved ones, when in fact they typically took into account only an economic one. In part 3, we will consider what American historians have written and ex slaves have told us about the breakup of slave families, and we will explore the inhumane facet of antebellum era American slavery. And that is it for part 2 of Remembering the Pain. We have to get to the point where we tell the story, because we cannot sit here and say that we have more in common with these rapists than we have in common with our brethren. We have to get to the point where we understand that they raped our women and that your skin color represents an interruption in the bloodline. Greetings, Shanique. How are you tonight? Thanks so much for tuning in. I appreciate you for being here. I want to say thank you to Anthony McPhail and Sister Raw and the elders that listen with her. I know that Forecast is listening. I know that Koku is listening. I know that Oni is listening. I know that KW Don 7 is listening. I know that Justin Liebert is listening, and so many others. I appreciate each and every one of you. But we have to look at the fact that these people were making children for profit. They were making children for profit because it was profitable for them to procreate with enslaved women, and it was profitable for them to to sell those children because that made them richer. And they could disinherit those children because they didn't have any rights to their father's name. They didn't have any rights to their father's land, and they didn't have any rights to their father's money. So when you tell me that you have more in common with the person that sold you down the river away from your family than you have in common with an African from across the ocean who probably also sold you, but for different reasons. It was because you lost a war, because you were already enslaved and they had a different conception of slavery. There were different reasons, okay? And some of us were stolen from those shores. So you just have to remember that all of history is true, all of history is not true for you. That's why it's important to find out your family's story. But that's all I have for tonight, guys. I appreciate you for listening. I value each and every one of you. I will see you tomorrow night at 7 o'clock, where we'll be reading part 3, The Slave Family Breakups by Anthony W. Neal. I will see you tomorrow. I want you to remember that every single thing that touches your life, whether it is religious, social, or political, must be an instrument of your liberation, or you must throw it into the ash can of history. What does that mean? That means that you use everything for your liberation, whether it is the people that you talk to, the people that you communicate with, the people that you hang out with, the relationships you decide to foster, the politics game, the political game you decide to play. Everything must be a tool for your liberation. And if it's not, then throw it into the ash can of history. It means forget about it. Burn it. Burn it all down. All right, guys. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time. Peace.